designer babies are something that is already happening to some extent and will happen to a greater extent in the future. And the reason I want to talk about them today is because they stir up a lot of controversy with people, especially the moral side of designer babies. But I think there's something about the moral reaction to designer babies that actually tells us something about the ethics of just traditional procreation. I got thinking about this because of a very recent interview that Trigonometry did with Richard Dawkins, where they got onto the topic of designer babies and they had a bit of a moral discussion. Now, I'm going to play the clip for you so that you can see it before I talk about the things that I think it highlights about regular reproduction. But before I get onto that, let's watch the clip. It is about 6.5 minutes long, so I will put a timestamp as to where it finishes if you just want to skip to my reaction to it.
And also as well, what it brings into, I mean, the term designer babies is used. I think it's more of a kind of tabloid description, but we know what we mean. Where babies are then having screened for certain genetics and certain genes are taken out or eliminated or played with. Do you think that scientists playing God, or do you think that's actually where we need to get to as a species, so thereby eliminating certain illnesses, diseases?
I think it's hard to find an objection to eliminating diseases. So I think as long as that's used not for making designer babies, but for screening against hereditary diseases, it seems to me that that's really hard to object to that.
Richard, sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
Do you not think there's a moral conundrum there? Because it kind of depends where you draw that line, doesn't it? For example, if you have a baby that's, I don't know, has a higher risk of cancer. Now, I have a young son. I wouldn't want him to have a higher risk of cancer. But if I could then, select him from a number of fetuses and discard the others, wouldn't that be maybe perhaps too far going in that direction?
Well, I don't think necessarily so. I suppose the way it might work would be something like this. In IVF, in vitro fertilization, a woman is given hormone treatment to superovulate, so she gets maybe a dozen eggs. And the dozen eggs are all in a Petri dish. And what happens at present is that the doctor picks out one of these eggs at random. They all get fertilized if they can. Picks out one of the zygotes at random and re-implants it in the woman. Well, instead of picking the zygote at random, you examine the genes, and this can be done when it reaches, say, the 8-cell stage. So you let them develop to the 8-cell stage. So they are 8-cell embryos. And then you can take out one cell of the 8 and look at the genes of that, and it doesn't damage it. And you say, oh, okay, this one has the gene for haemophilia, and this one doesn't. Why on earth would you choose at random if you know that half of them have the haemophilia gene and half of them don't? Obviously, it makes moral sense to pick one of the 50% that do not have the gene for haemophilia, whatever it might be.
I suppose the question that it brings into, and this is part of the other conversation we want to have with you in terms of atheism and religion, it brings into question life. What is life? Is an 8-cell zygote life? Can it be discarded? That's where the moral conundrum comes in.
I have no time for that kind of argument about is this a human life or
You don't? Really?
No.
Why not?
Well, because this 8-cell zygote has no feeling, it has no nervous system, it has no capacity to suffer, no capacity to feel pain. So that there's no moral difficulty at all in choosing. You're going to pick one of them anyway. You've got a dozen of them, and the 11 that you don't choose are going to be flushed away anyway. So you've already taken that moral decision in a way. It's a question of whether you choose one at random, or whether you choose the one that does not have the lethal or sublethal.
No, but what I mean is, once you've created that selection process, given that parents would want their children to be happy, but also clever and charismatic.
Now you've moved on to quite a different topic. Now you've moved on to...
But that's where I was going with
it,
right?
Okay.
So, and that's, I think, the core of Francis' question too, is if we've got the opportunity to select the optimum baby for us, are we not going to end up in a position where parents are encouraged to go down that path?
Well, yes.
Incentivized even.
But you've changed the subject, and I was talking about the removal of
I'm not trying to catch you out.
No, it's a very interesting question. And then you can say something like, if it became possible to know that of these dozen zygotes that we've got, some of them have a gene for musical genius, and some of them don't. We're nowhere near that at the moment, but if in the future that came about, then would you worry about parents who say, I want my child to be a great musician or a great composer, a great mathematician? And that's very interesting. It's a more difficult moral dilemma. If you object to that, then I might say to you, why do you object to that when you don't object to parents even forcing their child to practice the piano? See, you haven't done your music practice today. Get on with it. You're supposed to practice, because the only way you'll become a great pianist is by practicing 6 hours a day, whatever it is. Why would you think that is okay when you would not think it okay to pick out a zygote from a petri dish which contains a genetic predisposition to be a great musician? I'm not answering the question, but I'm saying that, in a way, these sorts of moral questions can best be answered by comparison with other things. And I'm just comparing in this case, asking sort of question a moral philosopher might ask. What's the difference between encouraging a child to practice the piano and giving the child a head start by giving it the gene of the ones that are available in the petri dish in an IVF situation to become a musician?
Well, I suppose the problem with the answer to that is we come back into the realm of religion and morality, because I think at the core of it is the idea that the creation of life is some kind of random miracle. It's supposed to be sort of, it's not supposed to be is a word that I've introduced, of course, but if we call it a miracle, it's supposed to be random to some extent. It's supposed to be down to chance. When we start interfering with that selection process, instinctively, I can't explain it. Perhaps I feel there's something off about that.
So I think there's a few interesting things to pick up on there. But before I get on to how the reaction to designer babies tells us something about regular reproduction, I want to talk about why it seems people have this moral reaction to designer babies. Now, there's a range of reasons people will have this reaction, but it seems to me in discussions I've had that a core reason people do is something that actually Konstantin Kissin mentions in the clip, and that's randomness. So while I don't think this is actually accurate, it seems to me that the perception people often have when the designer baby topic is brought up is that the reason it brings up this sort of moral revulsion to it is because designer babies would be non-random. Now, what that tells me is that regular reproduction is of course not random. However, I think when Konstantin uses the word random here, he essentially just means you don't know what you're going to get. There are some limitations on obviously how your child is going to turn out, but there is a wide range of possibilities of how your child will be once they're born. And I think the reason people prefer that is because if you procreate in that way, you are open to all of the possibilities of how your child may be. And so I think what that tells people is that then they are going to love the child for who they are. They are not trying to manipulate the child in some way pre-birth to get a desired outcome. They are happy with however the child turns out because it's a random process. They will love that child. Whereas the designer baby topic comes up and people then have this reaction to it because they think, well, if I'm creating a designer baby, I'm selecting for certain traits. And I think then that gives the impression to people that it's actually the traits that people want rather than the child themselves. And that then their love for the child, which people see as deeply important, and it is deeply important, is associated with the trait rather than just the baby. And I think the reason people think this is because, well, if someone was going to just love their baby no matter what, then surely they would just go for the random process. The reason that they're selecting for a trait is because actually their love is not unconditional to the child. It at least somewhat hinges on this trait. But maybe if the child didn't have this trait, they'd love them a little less. Now, personally, I don't think this is the case. I don't think this is an accurate moral assessment of the situation, but I get the impression that that is the reaction and that is what it's founded on that people generally have, and Konstantin expresses it in this clip. Now, getting to the main point of this video. So what does the moral reaction to designer babies tell us about traditional reproduction? Now, I think there are a variety of things that it can tell us, and let's go through them one by one. The first thing I I think it tells us is that if designer babies is a thing and we can select for certain traits and how we want the child to turn out, often to the benefit of the child, it emphasizes to me the gambling nature of regular reproduction. It's essentially like pulling a slot machine and not knowing what's going to come out. People dress it up in the language of beauty and gift, but essentially what we are doing is every time we create someone, we are running a biological experiment with an unconsenting test subject who doesn't stand to benefit from this test. I think if we were to change the imagery around reproduction and imagine someone just standing there pulling a slot machine, not knowing who's going to come out of it, but just constantly doing that, I think people would reasonably have an aversion to that and say, actually, I don't think that's something you can ethically justify, because you're imposing a random set of conditions on people, both genetically, but also you don't exactly know what their life is going to be like when they're born. And I think people should have the same reaction to regular procreation. It's like what the South African philosopher David Benatar said: if procreation weren't so natural and normal, it would be seen for the tragedy and travesty that it is. Number two is that it shows to me that procreation itself is selfish. When someone brings up the topic of designer babies and talks about choosing the child's hair color or how tall they are, I've heard people refer to that as selfish. And I think the reason that they say that is because those traits are being picked not because the parent really thinks that it's going to have a tangible effect on the child's life, although it may or may not. The parent is thinking at it from the perspective of what the parent would like. They want the child to have this height or this color eyes or this color hair. They are picking and choosing traits about their child to serve their own interests rather than the interests of the child. But if we hold up a mirror to regular traditional reproduction, is it not the same thing? Why do people have a child in the first place? It can't be for the child's sake, because they don't exist to want to come into existence. It's like Ricky Gervais said.
It's not as a long sort of cabinet full of potential ghost fetuses going, we want to be born, right?
So it can't be for the sake of the child, because there is no child to want to come into existence. And I think if people really thought about it, they would recognize that actually the only reason they're creating the child is because they want a child. They are creating someone who will tangibly and significantly suffer in their life and ultimately die as well, because they want to have a mini-me or experience the process of raising someone and introducing them to the world, or to fix their relationship problems, or to cure a sense of loneliness. It could be for a whole host of reasons, but if we think about them, the vast majority of them are self-serving. And so I don't think people should be too quick to point the finger at others that are proponents for designer babies and calling them selfish, because as we all know, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. The third thing I want to talk about is this idea that they discuss in the clip about removing types of chronic disease like cancer. Now, this makes sense. If you're going to create someone and you can assess the levels of risk they're going to be exposed to in terms of getting cancer or other things, and you can manipulate those risks to lower them and mitigate against them, then it does seem immoral not to do that. If you have the option of creating a child with a lower risk of cancer or a higher risk of cancer, it seems completely barbaric and immoral to decide to create the child with a higher risk of cancer. But what does this tell us about traditional reproduction? Well, it tells us that it's inherent with risk. Sure, when you have a designer baby, you may be able to turn the knobs on the risk to mitigate against them, making cancer less likely to appear in your child. But you're not going to abolish risk entirely. The fact that you can lower risk in designer babies highlights the fact that traditional reproduction carries inherent risk. And then it raises the question, when there is no one who exists currently and no one to want to come into existence to benefit from the good things in life that people point to, why would you impose the risk of cancer and other things on someone and the guarantee of death when there's no one to want it in the first place? And I think this highlighting of risk in the discussion of designer babies actually shines a light on the magnitude of risk. If someone were to go to a clinic and be presented with 2 sheets of paper, one with the risks that creating someone comes with in terms of diseases, depression, all sorts of things that can be influenced by genetics. And on the second piece of paper, it's how much those risks can be reduced with a bit of manipulation. I think seeing those 2 sheets of paper would make someone think twice about creating someone, even in the case where you are able to manipulate the risks. Just having them written down in front of you and highlighting the fact that you're putting someone at risk when they literally don't exist to want to come into existence would make someone think twice about about creating them. And I think the fourth and final observation that I'll make is really fundamental. So let's imagine this world of designer babies where you can tailor your baby to have as good or bad a life as you like. This brings up something that I don't think a lot of people recognize. Let me use a thought experiment to demonstrate this point of two couples. Imagine you have one couple who attend an IVF clinic and can screen the potential future person they are going to create. And what they find is that their child would end up leading a horrible life. Whether they can edit this out of the child or not, which would be the current situation, I think most people would look at this and say that those people would be doing an awful thing by creating that person. They would be creating vast amounts of suffering out of nothing. And even though there's no one who exists at the present moment to be imposed upon by that suffering, they understand that the decision they are going to make is going to cause that suffering in the future. And the nature of suffering being what it is, it seems like it doesn't really matter whether the suffering would occur now in a person who exists now tangibly or in the future as a result of your action. I think this is a reasonable moral judgment that most people would make. But let's think about the flip side. Let's say you have a second couple who live in this world of designer babies, and people now create babies that they can manipulate the genetics of so that these people, these new people they create, just have amazing lives. There's nothing wrong with their lives. Do we have the symmetrical opinion on that these people should create that person rather than just could? I don't think it's reasonable to have that symmetrical opinion, and I don't think most people do have that symmetrical opinion. I think the reasonable assessment seems to be that whereas with suffering, it doesn't matter if the person exists now or in the future when the suffering occurs, and it hinges on the decision you're going to make. I don't think the symmetrical case could be made for pleasure. I think it is morally relevant that the person exists now or in the future who experiences the pleasure, and it hinges on your decision. Because if they exist now, they exist, they have interests, desires, and they want to seek pleasure, and we should take that into account when we make our decisions. But if their existence in the future hinges on your decision, I don't think it has the same weight as the suffering, because if we were to create someone in the future who didn't need to exist but had an amazing life, it would be good that they had an amazing life given they existed. But it doesn't seem that there is a moral reason for us to create that person to then have a good life. And to me, it seems that the reason that is because the good life is only good because it serves the interests and desires of the person, which are established once they're created. Before someone exists, there is no interest or desire in that good life, and so there is no reason to create that person. And I think this thought experiment, based in the idea of designer babies, tells us something really fundamental about traditional reproduction or creating life in general. If we take those two assessments, that it's wrong to create suffering even if the person doesn't exist yet, and there's no moral reason to create someone who is going to experience good things, and we take them from the separate cases and boil them into the same person, it then tells us that there's no reason to create someone so that they can have the good things in life, even if they're a designer baby who's going to have an amazing life. But there is a reason to avoid creating them so that we don't impose suffering on them. So those were some of my thoughts on the moral reaction people have to designer babies, and I think what that tells us about the morality of just regular reproduction. Let me know what you guys thought of that clip, and also the point I made about traditional reproduction that I think we can take from the reaction that people have to designer babies. And let me know what you think in the comments, and I will see you in the next one.